Life in the 14th century. My research question is, how was a 14th century family affected by the major events of the late Middle Ages? During the late Middle Ages, Europe had been struck by a disease called the Black Death, which first entered Europe in October 1347 by Genoese ships to Messina. Then from there it spread to most of Europe. The disease could be spread by a flea bite or from person to person. In a middle-class to lower-class family, disease could spread easily because there was closeness when sleeping, since that gave each other heat. In those times, all you could see was death and people dying from the plague left and right, praying that you wouldn't be next. With no sanitation, the disease got to almost everyone, and in some places, what you would see is death everywhere. Children were the most affected with the plague. A child would contract the disease and eventually die a painful death. The family would be scared and wouldn't know how to stop or how to cure the disease. People would try to turn to their faith and turn to the church for explanations. Because of the plague, some of the priests fled, leaving the people behind who needed them to anoint the dead. Because of all the things that were happening, some people turned to religious extremists like flagellants who whipped themselves. During this time period, people became very pessimist. People started to doubt on what the church was, which led into the Great Schism, which started during the 1370s. When the cardinals chose for Pope Urban, he was trying to change the way of the church by condemning clerical extravagances. During the time, people had seen death from the plague and were confused on what to do, and wanted to have or to turn to something constant, which was a church, but it was also about to change. You would see Urban in Rome, while the cardinals had chosen an anti-pope named Clement in Avignon, France. In Pisa in 1409, the council disposed of both popes and got a new one, but both popes wouldn't resign, so there was a threefold schism. People didn't know who to follow, and because of all the things they had gone through, they didn't know what to do, and the people's faith began to dwindle and become weakened. At last the schism ended with one new pope, Martin. He took away the council, and nothing was done about a reform. What was left was a church weakness in the people, and because of all the events that had happened to them, they weren't sure what to do, because the church was a central part of their lives, just like family and marriage was. Marriage was also an important part of life for peasants, because after war and disease, survivors were the only ones left. After about 10% or possibly more of the population had died. So people were having premarital pregnancies to see if they were fertile before going into marriage. Children were an important part because they could help out with work on their farms or fields. People usually married people from their village, and occasionally the parents would arrange the marriages. Men would marry in their 30s, while women married young. Divorce didn't really exist during this time period because the church said that both people would have to consent to their marriage. Sometimes, because marriage vows were done in private, the spouses would say that they never married that person because there wasn't any proof of the marriage, so they could leave. Usually, the only way you could leave is if the spouse had died. So this is why divorce didn't really exist in the time period. Peasants and other social classes usually had large families in order to get the population number up after death and war had a great loss in population. The Black Death, the Great Schism, and family and marriage are events that occurred and that affected the 14th century family and changed all of Europe.